Thank you again, everyone, for joining. You have reached the webinar, which is going to be focused on the future of access control. This is part two of a two-part series, as we did have the first part a little over a week ago. So I would encourage you, if you haven't had an opportunity, to go back and review the first webinar. There was a lot of really good content in that one as well. So that you can find that on the Secure Technology Alliance website, but would encourage you to go back and take a look at that if you have interest. Is a little bit about Secure Technology Alliance. So my name is Jason Boers. I'm the executive director for the Alliance, as well as the U.S. Payments Forum. But the Alliance is really focused around what we like to call secure identity, right? And the intersection of three distinct industries within the identity space, which includes the payment space, obviously with the USPF, access control, or access as we like to call it in short, and then also broader forms of identity. And as you can imagine, is all three of those industries do begin to overlap in certain applications. And that's really where we like to find our home and try and provide value into each of those individual segments, with the focus kind of on the three pillars that you see there listed at the bottom, around collaboration of members, education out to the broader community, as well as providing a forum for networking amongst our members. But if you have any questions relative to how we're structured or interest in potentially joining the alliances, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Deb Farrell. We'd be happy to give you some more information, both on the Alliance and the U.S. Payments Forum. So thank you for that. As we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, Devin. So relative to this particular webinar, we wouldn't be able to put on a webinar like this without the contributions of a number of different people. We have three distinguished panelists, which I'll introduce here in a second, but it has been the efforts of a larger group that has really enabled us to do the last two webinars, right? So I want to call out specifically special thank you for Jerry Smith, David Ferraiolo, Mark Dale, Roger Rohr, Steve Rogers, and Bill Windsor. Thank you again to all of you guys who contributed to this webinar. It's much appreciated, so thank you. Next slide, please. So the three panelists that we have today, first off, so it is three parts, is John Jacobs going to lead the way off. John's background is he's currently the Executive Director of Federal Identity Solutions for IDEMIA. He's been in the industry for 30 years, so has an impressive career that includes consulting, business development, and management of computer-related physical and logical security solutions. He is widely recognized as a subject matter expert in a number of different areas. You can imagine high assurance credentials, ICAM, FICAM, and cybersecurity, as well as an established expert relative to a number of different standards around identity. And you can see the list there, and acronyms that many of you are familiar with. Equally as important as John is a key contributor for two of the councils within the Secure Technology Alliance, both the Identity and Access Control Council. So thank you, and a special welcome to John. Next up, we have Colin Doniger. So Colin is currently the program lead for Enterprise PACS modernization for the Department of Homeland Security. He's also recognized as a PACS subject matter expert in both the commercial and federal markets. When you look back at Colin's previous roles, as he began his career as a security individual as an MP in the U.S. Army in 2000, after that, spent 5 years supporting federal contracts as an electronic security technician. He joined DHS in 2009, where he's held a number of different roles, eventually serving as the chief of the physical security branch. He has a Bachelor of Science in Organizational Security from the University of Phoenix, and you can see a number of different certifications, including PSP with ASIS, CSEIP with STA, as well as NSCA Electronic Systems Technician Level 2. So special welcome to Colin. Thank you for joining, and also thank you for your service early in your career. So thank you for that. Next up is we have Lars Sonneborn. So Lars is another industry grizzled veteran. He's currently a senior consultant with ID Technology Partners. Again, equally impressive 40-year career that spans multiple organizations, focused around physical access control and high assurance identity credentialing. He's led a variety of U.S., Canadian, and British security agencies' PACS deployments, including high-risk facilities. He is the two-time chair of the Access Control Council for the Secure Technology Alliance, serving from 2007 to 2012, and then again over the last 3 years or so, 2019, and he's currently council chair for Access Control today. So thank you, Lars. He leads also our CSEIP certification program, which is actively promoting smart card, biometric, and PKI cryptographic technologies as vital components in overall system designs. So special welcome to Lars. If you hadn't had an opportunity to attend one of our training classes, this would definitely encourage you to look into that, either if you're yourself or people within your organization are interested in obtaining certifications around identity and physical access control. I know Lars would be happy to answer any questions from that angle. So welcome to Lars.
Thanks.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John Jacob, and he's going to kick off the first part of our three-part series here. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. I'll go ahead and scroll the first slide. Thank you for the nice introduction. So the objective of my presentation today is really to compare and contrast two different trust frameworks that are evolving independently for managing digital identities, and to evaluate if, in fact, the best attributes of both frameworks can be leveraged together to form the basis of a more secure and interoperable identity credential. I'll be discussing two types of distributed credentials, including the ISO 18013-5 standard for mobile driver's licenses, or MDL, and the verifiable credential model, which is complying with the W3C World Wide Web Consortium data model. The credentials described in each of their respective documents have a similar purpose, and both aspire to be widely deployed, interoperable, and support a broad range of real-world use cases. However, the ISO and the W3C guidance differs in scope, origin, and motivation. Consequently, while many of their ultimate goals are aligned, their technical details, scope, and standards differ in their implementation. Next slide. So let's take a look at digital transformation. So digital transformation from a document-based identity to a digital-based identity is impacting all the parts of the world that we live in today, from how we conduct finance to how we interact with government services, and more personally, how we transact with each other. And at the core of each still remains the fundamental requirement to verify an identity, namely just how a relying party proves that you are who you claim to be. There have been many advances in the last decade to be able to establish, verify, and authenticate a digital identity. And new distributed architectures have come on the scene, such as verifiable credentials that use the use of digital ledgers that assist in building trust frameworks and enable users to securely assert their identities to a second party. There are several models evolving currently that leverage the use of established trust frameworks to ensure that these identity validations occur and that they employ both centralized and decentralized distributed architectures. The next few slides are going to provide an overview of each type of deployment and then discuss the benefits of each one of them. Next slide, please. To begin the discussion on centralized identity management, we look to a familiar trusted framework that most of us know today for issuing and managing digital certificates, called a certificate authority or centralized repository. It manages all of the personal and non-personal entities contained in digital certificates within a PKI. For a very basic overview of this example, the digital certificate is an electronic document which provides information about an identity of an entity, and it serves to bind that identity, a person or non-person entity, to a publicly available key that represents the culmination of an identity assurance event. Digital certificates contain standard information in addition to the public key, such as the name of the certificate holder, the expiration date, and also the digital signature of the CA that issued it. The CA is used to manage keys and certificates, and it creates digital certificates which bind public keys to entities, stores them securely, and then revokes them when they expire. Digital certificates in a PKI are used to establish integrity and ownership of the public keys. The CA is responsible for validating the real-world identity of an entity, and once the CA has high confidence of an entity, they sign and issue a certificate to it. Then essentially any relying party can validate the identity and public key of another entity to whom a certificate's been issued by obtaining its public digital certificate and verifying that the signature is using the CA's public key. This way, the verifying identity knows that a digital certificate is valid because it's been signed by a trusted CA. So the public key infrastructure model provides a secure trusted framework for secure online transactions such as email, secure websites, e-commerce, and the digital signature from the CA is the proxy for trust in the real world as it represents the CA's offline conclusion that the entity is indeed who they say they are. So now let's look at how this applies to a mobile driver's license standard. Next slide, please. The cryptographic foundations of a centralized PKI approach also serve as the trust framework and basis for an MDL. An MDL is established based on the origin of the initial documents located in each state's system of record. This system is a record of a centralized repository of all of the individual's identity documents and biometrics that they provided upon applying for a state-issued driver's license. The use of a centralized repository for mobile DL is based on the ISO 18013-5 standard. This was established for the interface specifications for the implementation of a digital driver's license in association with a mobile device. These standards specify the interface between the MDL and the reader, as well as the interface between the reader and the CA. In this case, the CA would be the state system of record. This distributed trust framework of state system of record has worked well up to this point, but there are a few drawbacks and challenges to consider as well. Next slide. So the pros and cons of centralized architecture. So we're familiar with the system that the federal government uses today as the federal PKI, and this is the primary trust framework and basis for issuing all federal identity credentials known today, commonly as PIV, CAC, TWIC, FRAC, and so on, as well as the certificates that are being used for screening government websites, encrypting and decrypting email, and so on. As we evaluate additional considerations when deploying centralized public repositories, the cost factors of the management systems become very apparent. Most of the components, including costs for hosting, managing a PKI for smart card authentications, can be quite expensive when you introduce the cost of endpoint access control and authentication systems such as certificate revocation lists or CRLs, and sometimes those can be upwards of gigabytes for real-time CRLs. So it's a very costly infrastructure to support the authentication side of it. Looking at other deployment models of central repositories such as credit agencies, we see that they can be costly and potentially vulnerable to hacks. We saw in 2015 where Experian was hacked and approximately 15 million people's PII was exposed. And an example in a government compromise would be the 2015 OPM breach, where 22 million records were exposed of federal employees' PII, SF-86 forms, social security numbers, clearance levels, and other sensitive information, all stored in a centralized database. So the drawbacks of using a central repository and ID management can sometimes outweigh the benefits of a standards-based interoperability. Our information and data have been continuously shared with various companies and online platforms so that we can easily access familiar websites and purchase products that we need more conveniently. However, many of us did not realize that these actions put our identity at risk. This mostly happened because e-commerce and social media and business companies have control of our personal data. All of our private information is at risk of security breach, and if a centralized repository is breached, potentially all of the membership PII is vulnerable, not just one individual's content. An example at the state level is the origin of the identity documents are all stored within the state's centralized system of record database. The argument can be made that if the database is somehow compromised, the entire customer database would be exposed and not just an individual record. So as we seek to leverage decades of positive experiences using centralized identity management systems and platforms as a means for managing trusted identities, we also need to evaluate some of the drawbacks, including costs and PII exposure elements. Now let's look at another form of identity management. Next slide. Identity credential. So let's switch to a different type of identity credential, distributed identity architecture, commonly referred to as decentralized identity management using verifiable credentials, or VCs. To level set the discussion, let's look at what is a VC. Well, in its simplest form, a VC is a digital document that makes a claim about an identity. There are three basic components of the implementation: the issuer, the holder, and the verifier. A verifiable credential, or even a type of attribute of a digital version of a document, such as a title, a diploma, a certification, a vaccine attestation, or many other types of identity attributes that have been issued by an authoritative issuer and stored in a digital wallet. A digital ledger such as blockchain makes this new credential format verifiable both at the source and freely on the web, meaning that its integrity can be consulted without the risk of forgery. Verifiable credentials have a much different origin and intent while sharing many of the same features. They were developed out of W3C long after the ISO 18013 standardization process began. The W3C foresaw a need for a credential that could be used in both an offline and online scenarios, and that once a user had distributed the credential to the holder, the credential could be used without the issuer's subsequent involvement. The W3C focused on the data model as a blueprint to allow others to create ecosystems based on specific use cases. The VC data model envisions credentials that are issued by a trusted third party and then subsequently presented to a verifying party who could easily verify the issuer of the credential and be confident that the content had not been altered. The holder of a verifiable credential retains possession and complete control over who gets to see it and how the attributes are shared. In general, once a credential is issued, the issuer no longer is required to be involved in the transaction. Therefore, any verifiable interaction is permitted to happen confidentially between the holder of that credential and the verifying party. For decentralized identity to work in an attended manner, users need a mobile identity wallet, which is an app that securely holds the identity credentials and interacts with both of their issuers and verifiers. The requisite metadata needed to make the entire ecosystem work is written to a distributed ledger in the form of the new industry standard known as a decentralized identifier, or DID. The credentials themselves are always working directly between wallets, and to add a credential to that DID, an issuer would simply issue another VC. This model requires each VC to contain proof that it is cryptographically verifiable. The VC data model does not, however, mandate any particular format or type of digital proof or signature. So the challenge with this model is that it intentionally does not prioritize interoperability in the way that 18013 does. As such, it is not prescriptive in terms of how an ecosystem should be built for individual use cases. In short, the intended audience for verifiable credentials are ecosystem builders, and they can utilize the W3C blueprint model to construct an implementation of it. On the next slide, I'll show you some examples of several use cases of verifiable credentials. For entities that have a physical card and seek to digitize it in the near term, the biggest challenge with a verifiable credential is going to be interoperability with other implementations. And even if a mature verifiable credential framework does exist for a use case, it's unlikely that that framework will scale globally in the way an ISO standard does. So in summary, because of its prescriptive nature, VCs suffer from interoperability with other VCs, not within its own ecosystem. Let's take a look at a few examples. Next slide. I came across this slide which represents examples of the VC ecosystems built for different vertical markets. These individual projects were submitted to Affinity as proof of concept trials, but it shows the different types of VC implementations that are beginning to evolve. Implementations for healthcare, pharma, finance, transportation, banking, travel, and so on. And as we understood from the previous slide, the ecosystems being developed would not be interoperable with each other automatically. As an example, the finance verifiable credential would not be accepted into the pharma implementation because they each follow their own ecosystem blueprint guidelines. However, if they were to collaborate together and follow the W3C implementation guidelines, and or possibly employ and use some of the 18013 standards, they may very well be able to have both credentials interoperate within each platform. So you can see the challenges of interoperability across multiple and various ecosystems. So maybe the answer is to combine both standards. Let's take a look at that. Next slide. Now let's evaluate how both technologies might be combined to create an even better credential implementation for identity management. For this slide, I've listed at least 4 ways in which the ISO 18013 data model and the W3C data model may be combined to provide standards-based interoperable implementation. First of all, an ISO 18013 implementation may also be seen as an implementation of a VC data model, meaning it's possible to design a credential that complies with both ISO and WC3. Secondly, a mobile wallet that contains an ISO 18013 based credential may simultaneously be used to store an existing verifiable credential. The two types of credentials can live side by side in the same wallet, but do not necessarily have to share the data retrieval and security mechanisms. Third, it's that existing verifiable credential may be implemented as a data element within an ISO specified 18013 model, and in addition to its own security proof. And then finally, another way they can be combined is according to the ISO 18013, an existing verifiable credential may also be implemented as a separate document. This would mean that only the data element definitions of the VC are kept and the proof is replaced by the security mechanisms of the 18035, or I'm sorry, 18013-5. So let's look at real-world examples of combining these two technologies. Scenario of presenting a mobile ID at an airport security checkpoint. Currently, these document-based identity encounters only support ISO standard credentials, such as driver's license. They are used in Cat3 machines to validate the driver's license using multispectral lighting techniques and state system of record checks. So TSA, looking at this, may or may not choose to enhance the hardware readers for additional verifiable applications, such as a digital military ID or a digital health benefits card. They all have different physical characteristics than a DL and would require a different verifiable credential verifier. So rather than to try to convince TSA to accept their own specific flavor of a verifiable credential, VC architects could design their ecosystem to incorporate ISO elements into their data model and design so that their holders would be able to pass right through security checkpoints in the same frictionless way that an MDL would. So in summary, we discussed how both verifiable credentials and the ISO standards models for credentialing and authentication platforms may be loosely coupled to create a more interoperable and secure identity platform. There are different methods by which this may be achieved. Each of these has distinct advantages and drawbacks, and to date, neither the ISO standard nor the VC data model explicitly discusses exactly how this can be achieved. Both communities continue to further their own missions with their own intent, and discussions on this topic are continually ongoing within ISO communities, and we hope to one day see the eventual integration of distributed models that leverage the benefits of both technologies. That concludes my presentations for today. I really thank you for your time to listen to me, and with that, I'll turn it over to Colin.
Thank you, John. All right, Lars, you can go to the next slide. So during today's session, I'm going to present some thoughts about information sharing in a universal manner. This doesn't exist today for the average consumer, yet some government entities have taken a more in-depth look at the notion of information sharing in the government environment. For consumer usage and use cases, the timing might be right for this kind of an undertaking. We're surrounded by the need to vet our identities to receive identity credential and privileges for employment and as well as in our personal lives. How we use our identity or an extension of our identity to receive goods, services, vote, to perform actions like getting a driver's license or driver's license renewal. These are just a few examples of places requiring everyday identity verification. Next slide. So let's talk about use cases and where we might see them. Think about making a trip to your doctor, whether it's a general practitioner, dentist, any medical specialty. The common element there is you or I. So our basic demographic information has a role no matter the type of appointment it might be. So every time we visit a new practice, we'll fill out patient intake form. I can say for myself that my answers can be pretty inconsistent depending upon how much of a rush I might be in, the wording of the questions, the spaces provided for answers, or maybe even the type of practice I'm visiting. If I don't feel like the questions are relevant, I might elect not to share as much detail. The one consistent thing is that these paper documents seem to be associated with every visit. I can personally say that I've used the ZocDoc app before to book an appointment, filled out all the intake questions online, and then arrived at the office to still have to fill them out all over again on paper. So maybe there could be a better way to approach this. Moving along, opportunities exist. Sorry, I lost my spot. So opportunities exist for many different environments. Business venues in our lives use common demographic data. Identity data or demographics might be vetted, making online purchases like signing up with an online stock or crypto trading app, for example, or maybe going to a certain venue like a ball game or a concert. In many different use cases, basic information could be enrolled and shared to expedite receiving services with the higher level of confidence with advanced cryptographic security. The systems interfacing with such information sharing capability could perform the rules enforcement like HIPAA or one identity within a given state for voting. Next slide. Common attributes. So here's a list of attributes that we might see being used in an information sharing service. These attributes may be deemed common attributes used to identify a person, such as you or me. Likewise, the device or token attributes might be incorporated into the shared information in the service. So the device or token is how we interact with automated services and applications. The list might need to grow, but this is just kind of an example to get the conversation started, not intended to be all inclusive. And one note before we continue is that it's my firmly held belief that any system developed to provide the service at the identity level would need to be 100% fully decentralized. And going back to what John was talking about, that the ownership of the identity needs to be decentralized. So, maybe the services are in some kind of centralized repository for use in the different industries that they might be used in, but that identity itself has to be decentralized. So no company, federal agency or other organization or individual should ever have any ability to edit, modify, or deactivate somebody's identity. Kind of creates this slippery slope with, there's this huge vulnerability to different threats like, cancel culture or the idea of a social credit system or, things like that we have to have an ironclad defense from the inception if we were going to implement something like this. So, while I'm sure many of you guys can see the potential and need for a better way to manage and vet identity in public life, at the same time, it's accompanied by this, huge vulnerability to abuse. Next slide. So 1 second. So today, no real information exchange exists for consumers, even with events such as going to the doctor for routine checkup, or maybe when we're feeling under the weather. Or for those of you that like to keep a busy social calendar, one night in the theater, a couple of days later, a baseball game. Each of these interactions requires a one-off solution, whether it's a medical record or a ticket to the opera. Some driving factors exist that need to be focused on. So use case specific data protection, ease of use, reliability, just to name a few. Information sharing opens the door to a common approach to the identity/device attributes that we can seed applications with core data. Next slide. And so here is an example that of how we can apply this in our or how we're applying this kind of concept in our federal space, just to share with you guys. So when the APL, the approved products list, was updated by GSA back in 2013, kind of what I saw as a big gap is it didn't account for an identity management system. So with few exceptions, government agencies were already rolling out enterprise packs if they didn't already have one, but everyone was reading the FASCN identifier at the time, that 14-digit code. And in order to modernize to the FICAM standards, agencies needed a way to import certificate data to their packs. And there were two avenues: to manually, physically enroll their entire population. Considering how many years it took to roll out PIV initially, the idea of like having every single one of those people have to go back and then physically, go dunk their card to re-enroll their certificate data, it's not super feasible, not very palatable to a lot of agencies probably. So to solve this in DHS, we developed the PACS connector. So it provides this feature between our trusted identity exchange, it's an attribute sharing service that's fed by all of our authoritative databases or identity management system, our personnel security, HR systems, all these different systems kind of feed into here as our authoritative source. And what we do is we provide this localized service of this PACS connector that can go in an individual instance in each enterprise PACS for all the different agencies within the department. So, rather than having just this one big kind of instance of it with just, data from, 500,000 users floating around for 8 different agencies, we have the ability to, to localize it and then still get that same functionality, and then also kind of, limit the control to the operating agency. So at initial migration, existing records are updated and missing records are added based on the home component attribute. But then from there, enrolled individuals' attributes are updated whenever a change occurs. So, someone's maiden name changes, it's instantly updated, and someone's certificate is revoked, they're instantly deactivated in every PACS that they're enrolled in. So not just their home agency, and it's faster than the FICAM requirement of 24 hours. So it's essentially almost real time. Next slide. And then this is a comparison between the current physical GSA APL FICAM process and the PACS connector process. So for registering and managing identity in PACS, instead of populating identity from the card, attributes are imported from that authoritative source or identity management system via TIE, where traditionally a user has to dunk their card and enter a PIN to register their PKI auth certificate in PACS. The connector authenticates the public cert and imports the certificate information. So, PKI auth, cake, all of that data to the PACS validation database directly. So there's no need to physically go in there and put in your PIN. And instead of these attributes being bound to the PACS database, once they're imported from the PIV, they're kept up to date in near real time from their source database of the IDMS. Updates in real time as changes occur, as I mentioned before, like, examples, maiden names or certificate revocations. Deprovisions agency personnel faster than that 24-hour requirement. And one thing to add here is if you're kind of taking this concept and applying it to a different use case, this would most surely have the ability to do privileging. Just in the DHS environment, the way that we designed this, we didn't want it to assign privilege. You want to keep that privilege capability to the local agencies to control. So all this does is provision the card for registration into the PACS. Next slide. So in closing, let's look at the factors that have to be addressed to make such an information sharing service viable. Ensuring data is up to date, providing an opportunity for individuals, consumers to manage their information, what they're subscribing to, and then potentially what they want to be removed from. To be a successful service accepted in a wide-scale manner, the solution and its existence must be something palatable for consuming organizations and the consumers wanting to use the service. So this will only ever be palatable if, as I said before, it's fully decentralized at the identity level, and then untouchable by anyone other than the individual. I think a key challenge will be to find a secure enough method for the identity owner to regain access to his or identity or her identity quickly and easily if locked out as well. So anyway, this is kind of just to get the creative juices flowing, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for industry innovation and further kind of development on this. But that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I'll turn it over to Lars.
Thank you very much. So in today's world, identities have a central role in today's society. Whatever we're doing here, whether we are requesting access to identity services, or we're requesting access to board an airplane, or to access buildings in corporate or federal environment, or databases and records, identity records, we are using identities and identity credentials. So they play a more and more central role. And as we saw in the excellent session, Trading Identity Credential from Mark Dale, 18013 identity credentials are growing in popularity, and they're stored more and more in smart devices such as mobile devices and other wearables. Identities and identity credentials are used to represent us as individuals and connect us with the authorized privileges during the process of requesting access to those specific privileges. And this session is going to discuss how future systems may assign those privileges to us. So assigning proper access privileges at authorization often becomes quite a complex task, especially in large sites where there may be several hundreds of thousands of access control readers and many groups of people. Members of certain groups often have some exceptions to include additional or fewer access control points. And local provisioning can become just as complex when you consider what files are restricted and classified to what level, who may have need to know, who can access, who can edit, who can print records. And location at the time of access request also can impact what files may be accessed. Provisioning individuals who travels between multiple large corporate or agency locations adds significant complexities to this task. Now, what if, in addition to a basic employee record, a separate set of enterprise-wide attributes could be created and distributed to each site of an enterprise? As an employee visits other agency locations, the basic employee record could be linked to the specific attribute table at each site, and each site would have their own locally defined privileges instantly provisioned. This could make provisioning privileges more precise, more exact, and a lot less complex. So user credentials, that is something that we have, and it will store identifiers, and it may store or have a link to attributes, and it has authenticators, so we can make sure that it is the right person presenting this credential, and from there we can derive the privileges from the relying party. So what is the definition of an attribute here then? An attribute from Webster's is a quality or a feature that's regarded as a characteristic or inherent part of someone. An attribute is often a justification for authorization of someone to enjoy a privilege. Authorization then, that means that we are assigning that privilege to a specific resource, to a person. An example of a common attribute is a Class M on a driver's license. That authorizes the individual to drive a motorcycle. A mobile ID credential that's compliant with 18013 standards may store additional attributes. We're going to take a look at how a generic framework to distribute identity attributes can be provisioned in a per site-specific local environment policy for two different organizations. One is a chemical engineering facility, and another one is a healthcare provider. So each individual has an attribute that is associated to a site-specific privilege, and that makes the process of assigning physical and logical privileges depending on local environment policies for each group or individual. Attributes may be accumulated, such as being an employee of an organization, being a chemical engineer, have a PhD, maybe have a security clearance, but no safety training. Both access and visitor escort privileges could depend on current safety training. That is an attribute then that will carry conditional privileges. So the individual accumulation of attributes can become quite complex. An automated attribute-based policy processor could accomplish this provisioning efficiently to individuals or an entire group of individuals. So let's say here Bob, that is an employee of a chemical research company, Chemical Wonders. And for the purpose of this session, the company has a basic database for each employee in the company. And a universally unique user ID, a UUID, is created here to identify Bob's record in the company database. In this example, Bob, being an employee of Chemical Wonders, is an attribute that applies to a group of people, applies to employees. And that gives him basic access to the company facilities and company network and data records. So with Bob's company, Chemical Wonders, chemical engineer is a second attribute that belongs to a second group of people, the chemical engineering department. And in this case, that gives him access to all the chemical research facilities in the laboratory, all the chemical records, and the Q-clade areas and whatever hazmat areas there might be. And safety training may be acquired to access specific areas such as the hazardous material area of the facility, and also be required to escort visitors to certain areas of the facility. Now, should that safety training be expired, then that attribute will automatically cancel the access privileges to those areas and will automatically cancel the escort privileges to escort visitor in the facility at any location. So at the home facility, Bob has full access to everything, all access to all the chemical areas, all the research laboratories, all the test reports and all the test results. But when he travels to a different location of the same organization, that access privilege might be much more restricted and go to only to specific areas of that particular site that he's visiting. And during his visit, he may be very limited in what IT records he can see. He might be able to see only a limited set of data files. So let's take a look at how that same framework of tables can be used for an entirely different organization. Let's take a look at the healthcare provider organization, Health and Healthy. And we have a fictitious person here too, Dr. Alice. So a portion of Alice's identity record just in Bob's company, there is a basic identity record for all employees in Alice's company. That gives Alice basic access privileges to any of the facilities of her organization, Health and Healthy. And she also have a doctor specialty. She's medical, she's a doctor. Her category is oncology, and the specialty could be lung and throat. And the radiation certificate expires at some date, and she's in two regions, Maryland and Virginia, and the license expired. So in this example, attribute number 8 and attribute number 10 are conditional attributes with conditional privileges. So here's an example when the identity record and the attribute tables might be combined. So when somebody comes in here and requests access to these privileges, we have the user that requests this. If this attribute and provisioning processor is located at the local site, then this processor will look at the user attributes. It will look at the local conditional attributes and what the object attributes are that are a requirement to access those data objects or to access those physical areas. And that is matched up then against the policies. And at the end of this process, you will have a decision on what functions are permitted and what functions are denied. So if you spread this out here to an enterprise level, enterprise-wide or agency-wide, the employee identity and attribute value data can be shared using the methods such that the enterprise trusted identity exchange that was just described in the previous session, and that can be processed locally as per site policy for each one of the attribute values that we're trying to show here on this slide. So let's take a look here at it, what it may look like in a high-level cartoon visual type of environment. So if we have here then Alice, she has physical access privileges that are linked to the facilities in Virginia and Maryland. And the department of the facilities that she is authorized to travel to will be oncology, lung, and throat. And that will have a certain set of access control point in the Maryland facility and a different set of doors in a different system in the Virginia facility. And in Virginia, let's say that the local policies also allows medical doctors to park their car in the company parking garage. So that will be provisioned in here automatically for Alice. For logical access privileges at each center, Alice access is restricted only to oncology records of the patients of her staff. So she can see, she can create, she can edit, she can save, she can share, she can write prescription and print the patient's record for those patients that are in her group and of her specialty, but nobody else. We do have HIPAA laws to take into consideration here too. Now, being that she is a staff administrator, her logical account carries the privilege for her to create other account for her staff member of other and equal restrictions. So we have here two generic examples of how a generic set of attribute tables can be created and facilitate provisioning of privileges, both physically and logically. And as we were trying to show here is a generic set of tables that can be adapted to any industry here that we started here with medical facilities, healthcare providers. And so we have attribute names that have been created to fit that particular organization and that industry. And here are specific attribute values that are tailored to the specific user or group of users. And for an entirely different organization, the chemical research, the attribute names and the attribute values are created in the same way to fit that organization in that particular industry. So to summarize this here, the next generation access control system can use generic Excel type tables to create corporate attribute tables and values to simplify the authorization process. Basic identity records, additional attribute tables with corporate attribute names and values can define PACS door groups and other PACS policy-based access detail for each attribute value, and define logical access profiles, the account, with detailed privileges for each relevant attribute value. XML schemas and location-based attribute policy authorization documentation is something that we discovered during the research of this, and I will show that on the next slide where you may access some of these. So the benefit here is greatly simplified provisioning process for both logical and physical access privileges. And here are some of the excellent documents that we discovered during the research process of this. And I'd like to again say thank you to all the people that contributed to this, including Dr. David Ferraiolo here. So these documents, they will be part of the slide presentation that is available at the Secure Technology Alliance after the presentation, and be free to download. Thank you so much for this, and we'll now go over to the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Lars. Thanks, Colin. Also, thank you to John. We do have some prepared questions for you guys. We've got roughly about 10 minutes left. I would encourage anyone that is online that has a question for either three of them, please go ahead and type that into the chat box and we'll be sure to communicate that to the group. But I'm going to go ahead and start off. I'll go back to John. So centralized versus decentralized identity management. First question, John, you said there were 4 potential ways to have ISO and W3C trust frameworks work together. Is there one that stands out as the most advantageous?
Good question, Jason. I would say the first one that I talked about would be the most advantageous in terms of giving you both full interoperability and full compliance, as well as the ability to have a focused ecosystem. An ISO 18013 implementation also can be seen as an implementation of a VC data model, meaning it's possible to design a credential that complies with both ISO 18013 and with the WC3 model. So when you put the two of those together and you keep, and you have both the data retrieval, the security mechanisms, and the proofing mechanisms, and if you design them in concert together, I think that's probably the most advantageous way.
Okay, it makes sense. Thank you. Additional question is, I know you said that all PII resides within a centralized repository, such as a credit agency. But is PII exposed when using verifiable credentials on a digital ledger?
No, it does not. I mean, that's the part and the uniqueness of having a digital ledger is you only store the attributes that you want there. And if you do happen to compromise a digital ledger, you're only compromising one element of that digital ledger, not the entire database as per se. So you can store PII there, but it's certainly not linked or related back to the original verifier.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you. As I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Colin, then we've got a few questions for you as well. Question one is, do all PACS systems provide an identity or credential interface or API that can be provisioned by a PACS connector?
No, I'm not gonna say they don't, but I'm gonna say that one of the things that we would like to see happen across the industry is a standardization to use that all PACS manufacturers kind of move to, at least on the federal level, a standard API or interface for importing attributes to PACS. So what we've done at DHS with the PACS connector is we had actually Certipath built this PACS connector for us that is able to use a common REST API or LDAP to communicate to the PACS and then import all that attribute information into both the PACS and the validation system. So we'd like to see that become a standard thing across all PACS manufacturers.
Okay. Very good. There is a question that popped up in the QA box, which I think is probably yours as well, Colin. I'll go ahead and read it off. It's from Stephen Bartley. Is there a distinction on idmanagement.gov for LACS? Is there a separate certification for LACS for systems and integrators, so logical access control systems?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about LACS, but there's definitely a distinction for PACS.
Okay, and I don't know, John, please feel free to jump in here.
I was going to say that's some of my old stomping grounds there, but they did change a lot of the APL several years ago. They used to have CMSs and middleware and all kinds of things in there, but it seems that they made a big shift away from a lot of those. And essentially now what's on the APL are access control systems certified with head-end systems. And that's really, for the most part, what's left of it is PACS. And on the LACS side, the only thing you have are PIV cards that are allowed to access LACS systems, and those are all listed. But in terms of actually having a logical access control system on an APL in idmanagement.gov, that's no longer there.
Okay. All right, very good. Yeah, thank you for the question, Stephen. As Colin, I'll go ahead and come back to the second question too, is how would I apply the PACS connector concept in a corporate environment?
Yeah, so you could take the same identity concept. So we're using it specific to import that identity into the PACS. But any system that you're using in your corporate environment, like I'm assuming that you have most corporate environments at a minimum, probably unless it's a really small company where you probably don't need any of it, is probably going to have an Active Directory as that could be the source, or you might have a HR software that's going to be kind of your source for all your identity in your environment, or it could be that like decentralized identity piece if we get to such a place where everybody has this other credential that's imported in there. Whatever it is that any internal applications or whether it's accessing software applications on the phone, accessing your IT equipment itself, or that physical piece, is that you can take the same concept and then just use like this common language through, common APIs to import all those attributes into that system and then authenticate it. So authenticate the certificates and validate against the revocation list and all that.
Sure. Okay. Additional question for is you talk about a need for identity to be decentralized to be used for identity sharing services. Can you provide more detail on what that might look like?
Yeah, I thought John's slide was pretty great for that, but I think maybe something, using some kind of technology akin to, crypto, blockchain, a very, I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys, you probably know a lot more about it than I do, but, it's so similar to PKI in general that, I think that there's lots of different avenues through cryptography and, blockchain-like, methods that we could have this kind of separate decentralized identity that is 100% owned by the user, and then then that ties into those centralized different databases that where they're used. So maybe there's like a medical group that has one centralized database. So once the user has authorized their identity to be imported into there, then it's used there as they authorized it, but nobody can touch the actual identity itself. So they can touch where you've authorized it to be imported to, but no control whatsoever over your identity on the external to that. And then same with any interface you might have with federal applications or or any other venues or things like that.
All right, very good. Thank you. There's a couple questions for Lars. I know we've got 2 minutes left here. First question, Lars, is what if a member from a different organization visits the healthcare or chemical research facilities?
Okay, yeah, thank you. There's a couple of points to consider there. The first is that if we're going to have multiple organizations, that requires then a trust framework to make sure that the attributes are created and using trusted methods and they are managed by trusted sources so that these attributes can be shared and trusted by all the relying party organizations that want to share that. And another point here is that sharing attributes that also will require a common credential data model. And I suggest that the mobile identity credential that follows the 18013 standard could be very, very useful in here and be stored in a mobile device. And that 18013 solved both the issues with a universal carrier and for the users to carry that credential and the consumption, the systems that are consumers. And additional, the future access control system must include and support to consume these mobile identity credentials that conform to a widely used standard, such as the 1813 is going to be. And when we have this, we can have multiple credentials and multiple attributes stored, like we heard here earlier today from John's presentation. And the amount of integration that we can do then is basically unlimited. It's limited only by your imagination. So I think that is something that is definitely in the near future here. And I think it's a pretty exciting time to be in this industry to see all these integration tools and standardization taking place. I'd also like to just touch a little bit on the question that came in earlier about logical access.
Yep.
At one time in the CSAP certification, we did convert the access control system from username and password to smart card PIV and PIV-I credential logon. So we replaced the username and password to 2-factor or 3-factor smart card logon. And it was suggested by GSA that we probably could use the time better to do something else, because when it comes to IT security, that is something that the agencies usually want to handle themselves. So we actually stopped doing that. And as far as I know, I just tie in here what John and Colin said earlier. I'm not aware of any specific certification that is government specific for participating in this. I just wanted to get that little point in here too.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. With that, as it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Again, thank you to the 3 panelists for your time and effort in putting this webinar on. So thank you, John, Colin, Lars. The webinar will be available again on the Secure Technology Alliance website here probably in the next week and a half or so. So if you want to reference any of the data that we covered over the last hour, please feel free to do that. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to reach out, like I said, either to myself or any of the staff members from the Alliance, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you again for participating. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.